Hey guys, this is Caleb with DSLR Video Shooter, and in this video, we're going to talk about why I think a lot of people are wrong about the brand new EOS R. Now, there will be several videos on this camera coming out, including reviews, talking about all the different features, how it stacks up against other cameras like the GH5s, the Sony A7 III, which is lurking in the background, licking his chops. Now, before we jump in, there are a couple things I want to quickly go over that are pretty important. First, this is my third video entitled Why I Think People Are Wrong About Enter Camera Name Here. And I've done one for the GH5s when people flipped out when that came out and it didn't have in-body stabilization. And I did another one for the Nikon Z6 when people started trashing that camera when it was announced. And here we are talking about one for the EOS R. The next thing is I will be covering video specs when it comes to the EOS R. So if you're a photographer looking at this from a photography standpoint, you'll want to check out a different channel, and there's plenty out there, some good people, so definitely search for those. And thirdly, I definitely want to disclose that Canon invited me to their Hawaii event where they announced this new camera and new system. That said, they did not pay me while I was out there. They did not pay for any video content whatsoever. So this video and all future videos on the Canon EOS R are my thoughts and my thoughts alone. Canon has not reviewed this or any future videos. They simply wanted me to be at their announcement event. And the fourth thing is another disclaimer, and that is that Canon actually sent me and several others home with an EOS R for 6 weeks. So I have 6 weeks to do whatever I want with this camera, and then I send it back to Canon. I was totally not expecting this, and they really didn't even tell us until one of the last days. So that's kind of unexpected. But what's really cool is we can start putting this to work, and I think we should do that right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap out my GH5s, which is what you're looking at, and we're going to throw in the EOS R using the exact same lens, which is the Sigma 18 to 35. So let's go ahead and swap things out real quick. You can check out the specs here as to what I'm doing on the GH5s. We're going to be shooting with 10-bit there and then 8-bit internal C-Log on this puppy. So let's go ahead and switch out the cameras. Okay, so we've got the EOS R set up. We've got the 18 to 35. And we're shooting in C-Log, 8-bit internal, 4K all-eye. And now we're gonna finish up with thing number 5 you need to keep in mind, and that is that this video is not a review. I will have several videos coming up here in the channel, so stay tuned for that stuff. So with all of that out of the way, let's first talk about who this camera was made for. And in my opinion, it wasn't made for you, it wasn't made for me. This camera was made for Canon. Let's put ourselves in Canon's shoes for just a moment. If I'm Canon, there are 3 objectives or goals I have for this camera release. Goal number 1, stop bleeding and losing users to Sony and potentially bring some of those users back to Canon. My second goal would be to introduce or make a new system that is mirrorless that wouldn't kill off all my old gear or cannibalize all the stuff I've already made, and also piss off everyone who has all that old gear by introducing a better, cheaper camera. And finally, my third goal would be to make money with this new system by introducing some new lenses, and maybe people would kind of double up on the different systems. So if those were Canon's 3 goals with the EOS R, I think they nailed it. The EOS R is just good enough to keep some users from leaving Canon, and maybe a couple people will come back to Canon from Sony. Also, the EOS R has new lenses, which are really fun. We'll be talking about those in a little bit. But they also came out with a ton of adapters to make sure if you have a ton of Canon glass, you're going to want to stick with the system and you'll still be happy. It's not like all your old Canon gear is useless now. So people will keep buying older DSLRs, older Canon lenses because they're going to work on all these new systems. This new camera, the EOS R, is also missing some pro features, including dual card slots. There's a crop in 4K, which we'll definitely be talking about here in a second. So that's going to keep everyone happy and keep buying 5D Mark IVs for a more pro camera. So it's really the perfect camera for Canon. It's going to keep their users happy, their old users happy, their new users happy, and make them money all while introducing and joining and starting the revolution with this new camera system. So what does all of this mean for us video shooters? Well, this camera system is definitely lacking some features, but overall, after having spent a week shooting with this camera, I really enjoyed myself. It is a really solid system, but of course I was noticing those faults. So now we're going to go through the biggest beefs people have with this new camera, and let's talk about it. First, let's talk about the massive crop when shooting 4K. This is a full frame camera, but if you're going to be shooting 4K video, you're going to have a 1.7 times crop. And the reason for this crop changes depending on who you talk to. All week long at this event, I was speaking with Canon employees and asking them about this, and they always came down to this one excuse, and that was quality, saying that a center crop readout of the sensor was going to give you a higher quality than a 4K readout. And no matter what, that's always where things landed when it came to that conversation. But I think there are three other reasons that could be the cause of this issue on these cameras. And the first one is processor performance. Either the processor in this camera, the Digic 8, can't handle 4K full frame video at all, or Canon can't ensure their high data rates at 4K full frame, or perhaps 4K full frame would force them to do pixel binning of some kind, in which case that would obviously reduce the quality of their 4K on this camera. The second reason is product line preservation, if you will. If this camera had C-Log high bit rates full frame 4K, they're probably going to lose people from buying the C200, C300, or other future camera systems. And every single time I really pushed a Canon employee on this issue, they always ended the conversation with, well, if you really are a pro shooter, just buy one of our cinema cameras. They weren't getting that a lot of us love this small form factor. Being able to throw this thing on a Ronin S and tear around without a larger body, there's something to that. And obviously this market is blowing up, so I feel like that's kind of a cop-out, or at least they should just be honest with us. And I did ask several Canon employees if it was actually possible to do that, to have 4K in full frame, and they always kind of discounted it as it's really not that important. People have always been using Super 35, which this camera really isn't. So that's kind of poopy. So as it stands, if you want full frame 4K video, you're just straight up gonna have to look elsewhere. Something like Nikon's Z6 or Z7, and of course, this guy right back here, the infamous Sony A7 III. They're all gonna do that for you, albeit with a lower data rate. The next touchy subject with this camera is in-body stabilization, or IBIS. This camera straight up does not have it. And there was an interview with a Japanese, either engineer or someone at Canon, who essentially was translated from Japanese to English and said something like there's all kinds of things you have to consider, like heat, size, and cost, all as reasons why there is not in-body stabilization. I think they could figure it out, and maybe they will, but it's going to probably cost us a few hundred or several $1,000s more to see that in these cameras. So once again, if you want a full frame 4K camera that has in-body stabilization, we're still looking at Sony, the new Nikon cameras, and maybe Panasonic before too long. The next big issue that a lot of people have with the EOS R system is cost. This camera is $2,300, and if you want it in a kit, the cheapest kit available is going to cost you $3,400 with the 24-105. EOS HD wrote an article where he outlined why it's going to cost you almost $9,000 to get a starter kit with this new system, and I don't really see it that way at all. Here are a couple things to keep in mind when it comes to the cost of this system and these new lenses. The first thing to keep in mind is that out of the 4 lenses that were released for this camera, 3 of them are premium lenses. They're Canon L lenses, whereas this camera, the EOS R, is kind of the starter camera in this system. So it's not really fair to compare the camera price and the lens prices, because over time, Canon's going to be releasing more affordable lenses with RF mounts, like that 35mm. And if you're complaining about cost, try to find a $500 35mm f1.8 for your Sony full frame. It just straight up doesn't exist. And the second thing when it comes to this cost issue is that while the RF lenses are super cool and really interesting, we'll be talking about them in a future video, they're really not necessary at all for this system. You can buy one of the 3 adapters that will be shipping before too long, and some of them with the camera itself. And you can pick one up for $100, $200, $300, and $400. And these will essentially take older Canon lenses and seamlessly introduce them to the EOS R. So you'll be able to use, if you already have Canon lenses, all of those, or pick up very affordable, very fast lenses without issue. So really we're focusing on the camera price, which is $2,300. If you throw on the basic adapter, you're looking at $2,400 for this system, and it'll work with any Canon EF lens or EFS lens, which a lot of people forget about. So with all that covered, how do I feel about this new camera, the EOS R? Well, like I talked about in my Nikon Z6 video, if you alter your perspective just a little bit, things look a lot more interesting. So let's pretend for a moment that Canon never released this camera with a full frame sensor. Let's pretend Canon released a mirrorless camera that had an APS-C-ish size sensor, had dual pixel autofocus, was able to record in C-Log, and had a data rate of 480 megabits a second in 4K with the option to do 10-bit 422, and it had a flip-out screen. How would we feel about that? Just let that sink in for a second. A $2,300 camera that did all those things. I feel like we would be a lot happier than how we are right now. Another thing to keep in mind is there is currently, at this moment, no camera on the market with these specs all in one camera. So there's no other camera that has a flip out screen, dual pixel or really fast, great autofocus, 4K with the option to do 10-bit out over 422, a log filming mode, and high data rates. Remember, this thing records at a higher data rate than my GH5 or GH5s at 480 megabits a second. I'm not trying to make excuses for Canon. They have had a long history of removing or not introducing features into their cameras, all while having a higher price tag than most of the competition. But here's the good news. Capitalism always wins. So if Canon keeps this up, Sony, Panasonic, Fuji are all going to someday catch up. When that happens, the market is going to severely punish Canon. Another way to think about this EOS R is to compare it to the GH5s, which is what I started this video filming with. Both have high data rates, 400 megabits for GH5s, 480 for this camera. Both have a flip out screen. Both have a log filming format. Both record at 4K with actually a very similar field of view, as you've probably noticed. Both of these cameras are missing in-body stabilization, but this camera has dual pixel autofocus, and it's actually a couple $100 cheaper or about the same price, depending on if you get an adapter or not. So those are some things to keep in mind if you've been considering this camera. If in-body stabilization and 4K at full frame are a deal breaker, check out some of the other cameras in the links in the description below. We will be doing more videos on the EOS R, and things are just going to get more and more crazy from here, guys. That whole thing with the future Panasonic full frame camera, that massively interests me. So hopefully that gives you some hope or just a different perspective on this new camera and new camera system. Make sure you subscribe. We're going to be doing tons of videos here on the channel on the EOS R. Let me know if there's anything in particular you'd like to see. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you guys so much for sticking in there with me and watching, and we'll see you in the next video.